Well, thank you very much, John, for that introduction. My best wishes to everybody who's actually tuning in this evening at 5 o'clock. I hope you all get your teas and coffees and GMTs, or tell where you are in the world, really. It might be a bit early for that, so we'll see. Myself and Emily are going to be your hosts for the evening. We have a couple of questions that we'd like to ask Dr. Orna and Eyal, who's there as well, as part of this sort of presentation. Like John has said, it's going to be about 50 minutes, 60 minutes or so, where we're going to be talking and so on. I don't know, Emily, if you want to add anything at all to start off with.
No, sounds good. Sounds like we're going to have
good.
a lovely free-flowing conversation and looking forward to it. So it's good.
Good. Well, I'm guessing that most of you who are tuned in this evening are very aware of Dr. Orna Guralnik. Let me make sure I get that right. Thank you. Spot on. You'll probably be very aware of Dr. Orna's sort of work on the TV show Couples Therapy, which is on Showtime in the US and also on the BBC iPlayer. For those of you who haven't seen it as yet, it's a great watch. I watched all 3 seasons. I really enjoyed the last one, watching with my partner recently as well. What I should say is Dr. Orna is also a clinical psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and academic who serves on the faculty of the NYU postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis, and teaches a course in identity, politics, and psychoanalysis with culture in mind, as it says off the New York Times piece that she sent me recently. I'm not going to say too much to start off with, but I'm going to lead in with one question. So I read the piece that you wrote for the New York Times recently. It was a great piece. Thank you very much for sending it through. I was very much interested in the idea of ethics and how when working with couples, how issues of difference and diversity also have a socially constructed element to them as well. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how that works and how you see that playing itself out within couples. That's like an intro to what we're talking about this evening.
First, you're going to go right to the heart of the matter, huh?
First of being a therapist. There we go.
Right. We're not going to waste any time here. I think as psychoanalysts, we are raised to think about our ethical stance towards our patient. We have all sorts of issues like the way we structure the frame. We keep in mind the well-being of the patients that we work with, but we don't necessarily extend the idea of ethics to the social contract, to how we understand the way we are supposed to live with our neighbors. And our neighbors, I mean, not just our partner, but our neighbors and the countries we are negotiating with and the entirety of the social structure. So in that sense, the thorny question of ethics becomes really complicated when you really put your mind to it. One of the things that I've been talking about in my academic circles is how do we train as therapists, psychoanalysts, to really be thinking about these issues and not just think about it myopically. In couples, it's very similar. I think of couples as the beginning, a small political unit, which is how do you imagine people are supposed to resolve differences? I mean, 2 people will always meet at some point, some kind of difference of interest. And what's your idea? Are you basically, do you think like authoritarian solutions are the best way to resolve difference? Or do you think democracy is the way to do it?
I think it's an interesting discussion that we had around it. Do you have a particular viewpoint as to which one works best or not? A more democratic sort of way of working within a couple or?
I think, to be completely honest, I think generally, democratic solutions are the way to go and the only way to go. But perfectly honestly, every time I meet like the real issue of like the climate catastrophe coming our way, I'm suddenly like, whoa, what about those Marxists that were thinking about like benign dictatorship? So I sometimes vacillate when it becomes urgent. And I think that says something about like the Kleinian shift between like a depressive position and a paranoid schizoid position. You know, when we're really threatened, we're suddenly paranoid schizoid.
So we react against our defenses in some sort of way and revert back to whatever the scripts are to some degree.
Yeah.
Another thing that stood out from the paper that you published was around the ideas of privilege. I know we're talking about couples, but we're also branching out to the wider sort of social context, if you like. Can you say a bit more about how you view privilege as such? I'll keep the question fairly broad, and we'll zone in at some point.
Yeah, when I was writing the paper, I had many ways in which recent social movements have infiltrated the individual consciousness and unconscious and how it affected people's relationships with each other. But as I was writing, it became clear to me, just my opinion, is that maybe the main concept, I don't know, Eyal, what you think of it. I'm going to say a few words about Eyal, why he's here, but I thought that ultimately, like the most important concept that really made its way through these social movements and really changed the way we think is a different way of thinking about privilege nowadays. Privilege based on, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's like class privilege, whether it's gender privilege, but the concept of privilege has really changed the way we understand our dynamics of influencing each other. Just pause for a second and say something about Eyal. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to join you. I'm really excited that your group is in existence. I think we need to you need to extend and bring in like an American arm or leg.
If you're offering, we can have you.
But really happy you exist. And also congratulating Mick on his fantastic book. But I'm upstate. It's a long weekend for us. It's Memorial Weekend, and I'm upstate, and I just realized that my friend Eyal, who's like really my best friend, and he's a colleague that I've been thinking with, writing with. I brought him onto the show as well. He's on my peer supervision group. He's a very, very dear friend and interlocutor for all these ideas. We've been working on this like forever on these ideas, and we used to be like a tiny marginal group that has now finally moved to be, I mean, finally, like psychoanalysis is like woken up to the idea that the social matters, but we used to be like a real rogue little group on the side. Anyway, so I was really happy that Eyal's up here, and I was just like, why don't you join the conversation? He's like, okay, I'll come by.
Well, Eyal, it's a pleasure to have you with us as well. So please do introduce yourself to the audience.
I'll just say hello. I think we have such limited time. I'm not going to say beyond what Orna said. It's more than I need.
He's very serious academic, and he's doing a lot of work in this area that matters. So,
Nice to meet you.
Well, I think you make a very interesting point, and maybe this is one question I can ask the pair of you, because you mentioned that the political sitting so much outside of the psychoanalytic sort of framework and the thinking, and yet some of the earlier psychoanalysts were very political in their own ways and their own ideas, and this is an idea that often gets missed when we teach this sort of material. Come out to the modern era, where do you see the political within psychoanalysis, and part B, if you like, how do you view that as, how do you both view it as informing the wider society?
So, should I move to like the more semi-formal part of this?
If you'd like, if it works for you, if that's what so you haven't done what you prepared, you see.
I prepared a little way to structure my part of the conversation. So hold on.
Please do.
Pull it up. Hold on. Arrange my screen here. Okay. All right. So one thing is, it's always helpful for me. What's my screen doing? Sorry.
Are you trying to share your screen at the moment?
No, I'm just trying to see my own screen. Hold on. Give me a second. Okay, I'm there. So when we talk about like, what does the social mean when we're dealing with the social as therapists and as psychoanalysts, I often feel a need to kind of, it gets really messy. People talk about different things, and I have a way of trying to organize my own thoughts that I don't know if Eyal will agree with, I don't know if you guys will agree with, but what do we mean by the social as therapists? So one thing is this kind of increased awareness of the harm done to our patients by large-scale social structures, whether it's racism, whether it's transgenerational transmission of mass trauma, all these like big events that happen and affect the individual. Another thing that we mean by the social is keeping in mind that each one of us has, just like you were asking me, our own political and ideological beliefs as to how we are to live with each other. And those come up during treatments. And sometimes they come up in the form of how complicated it is to work with someone who thinks differently than you, like a different political belief. I mean, that's been like a huge issue nowadays in the States, you know, Republicans, Democrats. Another related way to think about the social is how much do we see our work as the work of an activist, of a political activist? And that could be literally working on persuading our patients to move to the left, or persuading our patients to go become activists, to take some action rather than sit and complain. Two ways that we can apply psychological and psychoanalytic theory to help move the needle socially. How are we being activists as thinkers? And then the last way that I think of the social, and I think that's a lot of the work that Eyal and I have been doing over the years, is expanding the way we think about the unconscious, and thinking about analytic work on the unconscious is also including the underlying normative social unconscious as part of what analytic work is, no matter what your political opinions are. And those, in my mind at least, are quite different, and they get really mixed up with each other. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can just add to what Orna said, that the third item, the understanding of how social forces, how social structures, you know, you spoke about privilege, but it's not just about privilege, it's about how they make us who we are, how whatever structure of normativity or whatever discourse, if we want to use a more social theory language, actually structures us as subjects, creates what's possible, what kind of person you can be, what kind of person you cannot be, how different this is in different societies, in different groups in societies, and in different times. We're going to talk later maybe a little bit about our social theory heroes and say more about that. For me, that's very important.
Yeah, I have a quote here from Adorno. Not only is the self entwined in society, it owes society its existence in the most literal sense.
It's a great quote there. So I think it says an awful lot about how we are formed by, very much by, as you're stating there.
Yeah.
One more point about this idea exists in psychoanalysis from the very beginning. Freud, seminal text, Civilization, Its Discontent. The idea is that we have civilization inside us. There's an agent of the social inside us, it's called the superego, and it's part of who we are. So this is an old idea in psychoanalysis, actually.
Right.
I was just thinking when you were saying about the social aspect of it, and it was something that I read in your article about when parts of the social aspect, so I think it was you mentioned the Me Too movement had become like such a big thing that when you were speaking to a client, she couldn't decide whether she should side with the Me Too movement or with a partner, because like they almost seemed opposite. And I'm wondering like how much you see the effect of that outside social kind of coming in with clients.
So could you, Emily, can you ask that again?
Yeah, so like how much do you see like the big movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and things becoming part of your therapy, like coming into the therapy room?
A lot.
Yeah, and like causing like that social aspect causing issues within clients and their relationships.
Well, I mean, of course, I mean, I'm assuming that the people who are in this meeting, we all kind of share the belief that, of course, these social events outside of the individual, outside of the home, have a huge influence on us, both in terms of, like Eyal was saying, like in terms of like from the beginning structuring who we are, but aside from that, also just affecting us. What's interesting to me, and maybe I'll give a couple of vignettes here. What's interesting to me is when these events affect people, whether they affect individuals, patients, or couples, and the couple is not understanding that that's what's animating them. Those are the moments that I, for example, like to grab them and write about them, because it's just like, you see. So I'm actually going to jump into two vignettes.
Please.
Yeah,
Vignettes be great.
Your question, Emily. So one vignette is this couple that I worked with some time ago. I'll call them Portia and Harry. She was Dominican and he was Anglo-Saxon. And they had like a beautiful, solid relationship, very romantic with each other. But when they were trying to figure out whether they want to have a baby together, they kept getting into these like weird loopy arguments and they could never figure it out. And it was not clear what is the issue, because they would only argue about the baby, about whether to have a baby, and also like weird expectations of what would happen if they have a child. Now, I tried at various points to talk to them about their racial difference, just to bring it up as if it's an issue. And they would always like make them feel like awkward, and they didn't want to talk about that. Although they were super open to other kind of explorations, like, Oedipal stuff, early childhood traumas, their different way of processing affect. They were very psychologically minded, but talking about race, forget it. It was just like too awkward for them. And then they came in with a fight that they had. They were at this fancy dinner party, and someone at the dinner party came up to the white husband and asked him about his wife. Oh, is this your assistant? And they kind of nicely like moved out of that weird situation, and of course they had like a huge fight about it later. And even during the fight, they couldn't exactly speak about race until the wife blurted out, "You're treating me like a second-class citizen." And I just jumped on that. I kept just repeating it. Second-class citizen. What is that? Second-class citizen. What does that mean? And then finally, she had like a certain kind of breakthrough, and she started remembering her mother's history as an immigrant, when she was not allowed to drink water from the same faucet as white people. And that kind of broke open the conversation between them, and like enriched their, like, really what they were fighting about. And he could then find a language to talk about the different expectations he has about what would happen to their child. I mean, he's coming from a place of privilege, and expecting like a good future for their child. And she's thinking about the future very differently. I mean, there's another couple like that in the piece I wrote for the Times, that were like class difference in terms of their upbringing. That's just one example of these issues like affecting a couple without them being conscious of it, but it's like really gripping them. I have another example of a couple. He was Palestinian and she was Saudi from, or originally both, their families moved to the United States early on. They were living in Brooklyn, and they entered treatment after a crisis between them in which she, her family, even though she was Saudi, her family moved to Denmark at some point and then to the United States. And she had an annual visit to Denmark with her kids and suddenly realized, oh, I can get an EU passport. She asked her husband to send a copy of their kids' birth certificates. And he suddenly refused. And suddenly he was like very paranoid about her motivations. Does she want to like take the kids from him? And suddenly he got like really mistrustful towards her. And it was like a sudden possessive like battle over the kids' bodies that made no sense in terms of their histories. I mean, they didn't have like a history of betraying each other or like cheating on each other. It was just suddenly this erupted between them. And the usual kind of intervention, like, okay, let's talk about affect modulation, of like, talk about your individual histories, or I don't know, better listening skills. It was all like, forget it, didn't do anything. And really what we had to do is link their impasse to, in this case, the plight of the Palestinian people, in which like the issue of like having a passport is a profound issue. Like they are not given like statehood identity. So it's like a super vulnerable position for this husband to like let someone else like possess his kids in this way. Yeah, so in response to your question, those are the kind of issues that let's say Eyal and I would think are like super relevant to a psychoanalytic exploration.
Yeah, I mean, really powerful stuff, and thank you for sharing those with us. Just to bring Eyal into it a little, I read just very quickly on the information that was sent today about how, and I hope I haven't misinterpreted it, but you were saying about, it was just on the link that we got sent, and now the words just completely gone out of my head, like the work around not refugees but
Immigrants.
Yes, how like, and how that's kind of, it's almost kind of like so layered, not just, it doesn't just mean somebody who's kind of misplaced, like kind of from a different place. It's, I suppose you're better at talking about it than I am. If you, I don't know whether you want to say something about that.
Yeah. So as you know, as Orna says, we've been immersed in social theory for decades, trying to figure out this thing that we're talking about, and we each have our background. I mean, Orna loves Althusser, I love Foucault. We've brought, and Deleuze and Guattari, we brought them to talk, and other people, and we've been for a long time trying to understand how the insights from this mostly French, but not only social theory, can help us understand what people are and what is their trouble that they're bringing to us. You know, and we thought about interpellation and ideology and power, knowledge, as Foucault talks about, and many other ways in which all kinds of social forces mold us and make us what we are. Recently, and that goes directly to your question about immigration, Emily. Recently, and part of my own development as a thinker, but also as a person in analysis, I really started thinking about all of this from the other side, not just how we are forced into all kinds of ways of being and subjectivity and intersubjectivity and so on, but that part of us that wants it, that is asking for it, and that cannot survive without it, without social signification, without attachments to all kinds of groups and collectives, or to use one word that I've really been into recently, belonging. We all need to belong. And it's in the beginning, perhaps we belong to the little group that is our family. But if you think about it, when our parents begin to have us in mind, they already are imagining who we are, what identities we have, where we come into the world. So we belong before we're even born. You know, if you think about gender, it's very easy to say, are you boy or girl? But there's many, many other ways. And we're imbued with those things and we want them. We want them, they're attached, there's forms of attachment and need. And so how do we think about this in psychoanalysis? Immigration is a particularly good case. It's the case of both of us also, who came here from another country, who I can talk about myself, have many, many problems with the country I come from, which is Israel. But at the same time, there's this, it's part of who I am in very deep ways. So this whole, I think this is, immigration just makes it clear, but we all have this thing of what do we belong in, how does it make us who we are, and how much we need it, and how much we're afraid to be, for example, excommunicated or exiled, because we lose meaning, we lose ourselves if we don't belong. So that's how I've been thinking about it recently.
I can contextualize it a little bit again, put it against the backdrop of more traditional psychological and psychoanalytic theory, which is that typically we imagine, I mean, if we stay in more traditional theory, we imagine the subject as coming into the world with innate drives, whether it's like the true self or personal idiom, in Winnicott's language, spontaneous gestures that then come into supposedly some kind of inevitable clash with the social, with civilization. But some idea that really what we want to be is our individual self. And there are all these things like whether it's our mother's anxiety or the father's super ego interventions that kind of mess us up. But really what analysis is about is like bringing us closer to our true self. But if you think both about like critical theory, like social theory, which talks, as Eyal said, about like how the world is really coming at any newborn and like making them into the subject of the state. Or if you think about what Eyal is saying, which is that we're born with the need to belong, not only to be some kind of self, but to connect to the social. That's a very different way of thinking about psychoanalytic theory of the subject.
I think it's very useful to actually explore it in a way. I want to take this a stage further, if I may, with both of you, Eyal and yourself, Orna, as well. And I'm thinking a bit about groups that get marginalized in this formation of a sense of self. And one of the, in the States and also here in the UK to a different degree, the LGBTQ community are often very much vilified for varying reasons, especially the trans community. What are your views on the need for the group that feels that comes together, that belongs, and their propensity to actually marginalize? What do you think is behind some of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing how we as humans like keep like creating these groups and then marginalizing them and like imbuing them with like everything we don't want to own. You know, one way that I in when I talk about like how to bring psychoanalytic theory into like the social and how to make it useful for the social, I mean, we can always go back to Klein and projective identification, right? Which is that a group gets created. Let's say we create this kind of intense distinction between heterosexuality and queerness. Like, so first we create this kind of fierce and possibly false boundary, create a group, and then project onto them whatever we don't want to own. So gender, like male, female. So the male identity projects everything they don't want to own onto the female, whether it's, I don't know, emotionality, dependency, or from the female side, projecting onto the male aggressive ambition. Anyway, these qualities get split between, projected onto the other group, and then you can like enjoy hatred and attack whatever you've disavowed in yourself. it's pretty extraordinary how people do that. I mean, I see that now in the States between Republicans and Democrats. It's like a caricature. Like each party is a caricature of the other. It's not just one. So I think projective identification is a really useful way to think about it. I don't know if you have other thoughts about that.
About the marginalization.
Yeah, and why we're doing it, and what about that?
I've, as you know, I really like René Girard. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the theory, but there's a whole line of theory that is looking at what happens in society in terms of keeping a core and then sending someone out through the concept of the scapegoat. Something that has existed, from the beginning of civilization, basically, that societies cannot, collectives, groups cannot tolerate, this according to some theory, their own competitions and violence and possessiveness. And they have to take somebody and send them out as if when they go out, they carry all the badness.
That's projective identification.
Yeah, and it's just not on a social level.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, and
Yeah.
I think that's a basic structure of. We have it psychically instead. We have all our own parts that are disavowed, that are denied, that are negated, that are repressed. We have an unconscious. The unconscious is everything that's pushed out. So we have it internally and we have it socially. That stuff that we cannot deal with only socially, a lot of the times it's just put on some kind of goat, then gets kicked out, or is oppressed internally, which is also very often a class of people that.
Yeah.
Do you think that ties in with a lot of weaponizing of words like privilege and woke? Kind of there's quite a lot of weaponization against those types of terms where they might have started off as something positive, but because people have got to turn them around and, like you say, push it away and become like a scapegoat for something, it ties in with that.
I think the weaponizing of words like woke, to me, it just seems like a defensive maneuver. I think the woke movement has introduced like an enormous amount of change into society. And I think there's a lot of defense against the change, but I think I'm not worried. I think the change is deep and profound and there's no going back. So I'm just waiting for that defensive reaction to calm down. Personally, that's my interpretation of it, that it's fine. It'll take time, but I in writing this this piece, I was using an example of a couple that I didn't make it ultimately into the article, but I had a couple that I was working with on the show that they were both like super anti-woke. They were actually comedians, and they would poke endless fun at like the woke people. And then at some point, and especially at the Me Too movement, the husband was quite a misogynist, like self-identified as misogynist, and the wife was like happy to go along with it. And at some point during our work, the Kavanaugh hearings happened. I don't know if you guys are aware of like the whole Kavanaugh hearings here. It was like really, really like peak disgusting moment in American politics. And everyone was day in, day out watching on TV Blasey Ford describe her own like being raped by this guy in great detail and with great dignity. And that really like put a lot of engine behind the Me Too movement. And during our work, the wife, watching these hearings on TV, suddenly started to remember herself being raped also as a teenager. And she was like, wait a minute, that was actually really awful and really damaging. And then the husband started to remember ways in which he was sexually assaulted as a teenager. And their whole treatment kind of got scrambled by this. So, you know, even the most anti-woke people eventually like have a moment where they have to grapple. And it might not be now, it might be down the line, but I mean, there's no going back.
You feel there's hope.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that jumps out of your article. I know, of course, people in the chat are asking for access to it, and we'll sort that out from our end. But the level of hope that you see in these movements, in Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ movement as well, the level of hope of moving things forward, because defense is, okay, they're there for a reason. We know that as psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, or whatever else, and yet the work is to help dissolve or to work with them to dissolve them in some way, shape, or form so that something new can come through. But it takes time. In what way do you see hope, especially the political and the social constructions of this, in what way do you see this taking us forward, if at all?
Well, that's one of the reasons I wrote this piece for the Times, which is that there's so much focus on the backlash in terms of what these political movements are bringing, that they've polarized the country, at least in the States. There's all this anti-woke like worry. We have this whole crazy issue with like race critical theory, and there is serious backlash. But I think we have to take the long view. And I mean, there's a problem with taking a long view when we have climate coming our way, but let's pause on that for a second. I mean, that puts the long view in question, but assuming we're somehow going to deal with that, I really don't think there's a way back. I think once you've seen, I mean, we see it with like LGBTQ. I mean, at least in the Western world, okay, there's like some states in which there's still, again, fights about like legality of marriage, but the church has changed already. Even the Pope has changed. I mean, there's been like huge change. And okay, there are going to be pockets of like struggle, but I don't think there's a way back. I think what we've seen, we cannot unsee. And we've seen certain kind of wrongdoings, stupidity, ignorance, and there's no way back. I mean, if you look at society as a whole over like decades or millennia of history, we're moving forward on the issue of social justice. We're not going back.
I think it's a fair point. I know society doesn't move in a straight line anyway. It always meanders like a river, as Hegel would put it. You've mentioned the climate emergency a couple of times. I think it'd be remiss of us not to give you a bit of space for you to talk about that, because it does set a sort of time scale for lots of this, in a way. Can you say a bit more about how you see, I don't know, social justice movements and the work around climate emergency, and how do you see that working together?
Well, I mean, people differ in terms of like what they think. I mean, people who are involved in social justice and in political activism, people have different priorities. You know, I have like Eyal, and I have a Black colleague that we're working with who often says to us, when I talk to her about climate, she says, I understand, but for me, race is just like, this is where my fight is. I'm going to leave climate to other people. For me, I mean, I guess since I'm like temporarily white, I mean, for me, climate is like the top issue on our agenda, because it's like, what else? I mean, what are we talking about if there's going to be no more world left for mammals, humans and mammals? I don't know. Am I really like concerned about the I don't know. For me, it's like the top issue on our agenda, and the most urgent. And I find many of the struggles that are happening now politically in the world, I interpret them as an unconscious defensive response to climate catastrophe. For example, the polarization that I see in the United States, I don't think it's really about like critical race theory. I think it's about panic about climate and who is this earth gonna be left for? So in a way, the accumulation of wealth is to protect the rich from the climate catastrophe coming. That's how I see the polarization nowadays. And in my mind, I keep trying to go back to that as like one interpretive frame to explain what's going on, like this like incredibly horrible moment that we're in terms of polarization. So I try to bring my interpretations back there. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that.
For me, when we're having this kind of discussions, always the question is, when we say we or our, as you refer to that, who is we?
Right.
And especially apropos of social movements and what the hope that we have, or the, as we're talking here, it makes me think about a conversation I had. I'm teaching a class at a psychoanalytic institute. And there are 10 candidates, 3 of them are people of color. And 2 of them are always having huge arguments. And yesterday, one argument was about, there was a case here in New York where a Black homeless man was killed on the subway by a white passenger, because the guy was violent or threatening, or so a white guy just killed him, put him in chokehold and killed him on the train. And one person in my class was talking about it and pointing to us that as this was happening, as the news, the front page talked about this person who has mental problems, behaving weirdly on the train and then killed by another person, happens to be homeless. On the same day, there were news on the same page of a newspaper that the rents in New York are going up 10%, controlled rents. And people are not making the connection. Homeless person, rents are going up, as if it's 2 different stories. But then the other person, also a person of color, talks to her and says, this is bullshit, this whole, you're talking about how much rents cost in this country. They kill Black people, so they killed another Black person. And there's a conversation developed between them as who is we? The 2 of them could not agree that they are the same we, because one is thinking in terms of economics, and one is thinking in terms of my skin is going to get me killed, no matter I have a PhD, I'm this, I'm a famous person, my skin is going to get me killed. And she says, there's this war, and I'm a prisoner of war in this society. That's how I feel.
Yeah.
So.
And I have a friend, bringing it to climate, I have a friend who says to me, I'm not worried about climate. I'm rich. I live in the Northeast. I'm not worried about climate. Other people are going to suffer tremendously. I'm not.
So who's the we that we're hoping for?
Yeah.
Who's the we that's holding the hope? I think we always have to ask these questions. It's never.
I think.
I'm curious about where our audience is at.
Sure.
Like what thing we're
Well,
saying.
I've tried to do along the way is pick out some of the questions. I think there's lots of comments in the chat. You can keep an eye on the chat as we're talking right now. I think they're following a lot of what we're saying, or what you're saying, both of you are saying, really quite well. And there are a few questions around, or opinions around climate and so on, and race and difference and so on, which sort of follow your points. There's a lot of appreciation around the idea of splitting as well, which is something I've noticed. And the recognition that actually that plays a huge role in some of what we're talking about and what's going on in society right now. So it's worth just mentioning that and acknowledging that. So thanks to those. And I will ask any questions that come through in the next few minutes or so. But one question that did stand out for me, and I'm going to pose it to yourself, to both of you, is what can people do? What can people do next, basically? So we're talking about all these sorts of things. They're not abstract, but they're real. They're in the world. They're here right now today. We're dealing with all Eyal, you just mentioned the chap on the subway who was murdered the other day. So these are real life examples. I remember reading that news story, being horrified by it, because of course he was let free by the police within a day or so, and then was arrested later on for some bizarre reason. So what can us as therapists, activists, what can we do?
Well, I see basically, I try for most of my actions in the world to not be dissociated from my politics. Not everything. I try to have some moments in which I'm just like seeking some kind of joy, but most of my actions, I tie them to like, I ask myself, how are they related to my politics? So of course that's related to what I'm doing with patients. I do see my work with patients as political activism, and sometimes good political activism, sometimes not good. And I'm aware of the fact of like when I'm not doing a good job as an activist, like when I have a client who's like really obtuse to their impact on the world, and sometimes it's really hard to interpret, and I don't.
Oh, we've
Well,
just
you've just
lost
gone on
your
mute
audio.
there.
Yeah.
It's just gone on mute. So if you just unmute, there you go. Great.
Okay. So in my work with patients, I'm doing that. I mean, in other work that I do and what I write, the kind of academic work that I do, obviously the work we're doing on the show, the team and I are like really, really committed to the political implications of what we're doing. We take it super seriously. And every time there's like some kind of ethical conflict between, let's say, what's good for TV as opposed to what's good for the world, we're always going to choose what's good for the world, as long as we're aware of it. I raise my kids as citizens. As much as I can, I take them to like marches and talks before they're even aware of what's happening to them. I talk in that language. I think that's what we do. And I think it's important to like prioritize. Actually, and another thing to say is where I put my money. So and choose what your priority is. I mean, for me, it might be right now more about like climate. For other people, it might be about race. I mean, choose like where your politics are and go for it. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I do, but let me just tell you one story about Orna. We were it was kind of big social gathering in our house years and years ago, when some of us or friends had small children. Now the children are bigger now, and there was someone, a good friend of yours, who was and there was another friend who's gay and came there with his partner or husband, he was at the time. And the guy, your friend who was straight, said something to the effect that maybe we should not talk about some aspect of queer life because they're children in the house. Remember that?
No.
I'll tell you
Ew.
later who it was. And then, and I'm gay too, but I'm just used to this. Okay. But then Orna said, I'm not going to have this in my house. And yeah, I'm not going to have this kind of something said in my house. So that's how Orna. But to answer to your question, I think it's also what we do in life is what we do in life. But also as clinicians, I come from Israel, and the situation, and I have, because of that, I have a lot of Israeli patients, both here in the United States and people who are zooming from there or have been here and gone back. And the politics of Israel is very, very important to me. I refuse to go to the army for political reasons. And I have strong beliefs in that regard. And I have, because Israeli patients, most of them have been, men especially, but also women, have been in the army. And some of them have done all kinds of difficult, violent things. And it's important to me to bring to their awareness the suffering that they have gone, forget about the injustice, but the suffering that they have gone through and that they live with, and the conflict, and because they were exposed to having to do those things, and negotiate this with what I've said before, that we all belong also. So the struggle with recognizing that some of what you do in this life is violent, is unjust, is demanded of you. Maybe you're not aware of it, but it actually is part of what you are. That's, for me, is also to bring people to become aware of their own violence, their own aggression, their own participation in forms of injustice, so on.
Just brilliant for you to share that. Yeah, thank you. Lovely to kind of see the personable side of Orna as well, kind of coming out there. I am just conscious of time because I know that we're kind of coming towards the end. And I didn't know whether we should maybe pick some questions out of the chat if we have got a little bit of time to do that. If we're happy with that. Or maybe if I can just maybe merge some questions together, so we haven't got time, but there's a lot of questions about how you, Orna, when you're working with clients, decenter privilege, like your own white privilege, and working with like other like diverse clients, Black clients, LGBTQ clients, and kind of how you manage that, like how you manage to work with that.
Yeah, I it's very important for me, for Eyal, I know, to make sure to loop it into the conversation, that it's never comfortable. There's never like a good moment, but to just kind of uncomfortably loop it back in and talk about it. Yeah. I, by the way, took a peek at the chat just for a second, and I just saw a few comments that meant a lot to me about, like, you know, the animal world and with which we share the earth, and I agree.
I mean, it seems a bit pointless trying to fight for something if there's nothing for us to be on.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Do people in the UK speak about AI now a lot? Because some of my patients are freaking out before climate, where the machine is taking over tomorrow.
It is starting to come in, is my sense. So that could be that's another conversation further down the line. I'll pass it over to Mick. We'll have another conversation about that at some point, because that's the whole political thing as well, in a way. We are sadly out of time, I think, aren't we, Emily? Is that correct? Or
I would say so, yeah. We're out of time. See Mick there. Yeah.
That we'd like to both say, on behalf of everybody here this evening, if we can say thank you, Eyal, and thank you, Orna, for all of your support and so on, and for coming on for this hour. It's been really a great talk, and lots of great comments in the chat here. Thank you both very much. I know there's lots of thank yous going through the chat right now.
Send us the chat. Send us the chat later.
We will do. I'll get John, John, the expert. He can sort all that out for you. He's waving his hands right now. Thank you very much for coming along today. It's been really great to work with yourselves.